This is the Tree of Life, Season 16, Chapter 6. In this episode, we will be talking about the relationship between path parsimony and negation, and time parsimony and affirmation. To start out, we begin with the recognition that the linking of the affirmation of an impulse within an analog structure to the affirmation of the same impulse within a parallel digital structure represents an affirmational valence as between those two structures. This affirmational valence is associated with time parsimony, that is the linking of the phase of affirmation with respect to a particular impulse between two or more structures. This makes sense since we understood that the negational impulse reflects the scale of negation, which is magnified or amplified with each substitution event, resulting in an accelerating convolution as it descends. These descending convoluted paths are all associated with greater time than that reflected by path parsimony. In other words, the movement of time reflected by the linking of affirmational phases, as between parallel structures, is determined by a unit described by the affirmational phase. Whereas, each negational impulse generates through a distinct arrow of time, a comparatively longer period corresponding to the phase, descending into infinite recursion. Whereas, we can see that from the perspective of the negating individual, path parsimony excludes these convoluted paths, which are nevertheless reflected within time parsimony through the causal reordering produced by transformation of the analog structure into a digital one. From this we can see that path parsimony is a product of negation, just as time parsimony is a product of affirmation. Or more accurately, the linking of parallel structures with respect to a given affirmed impulse produces time parsimony, whereas the converse produces path parsimony. Let me give you an example. If we return to the example of the dance floor, what we see is that the substitutionary impulse is affirmed in that case, being the impulse to have a drink with the friend, whereas the negational impulse is reflected in the parallel digital structure whilst in its negational phase. Thus, we see that in this case, as between these two parallel structures, path parsimony describes your path relative to the woman on the other side of the dance floor. This is so because there is a linking of phase, as between two parallel structures, through linking of the negational phase. On the other hand, if we flip the two impulses within the analog structure, such that the other impulse is affirmed in both structures, namely going and asking for the woman's name on the other side of the dance floor, then this would accord with time parsimony, the linking of affirmation as between the two parallel structures. Thus, in this case, you remember the path associated with time parsimony, with all the concomitant experiences that result from that intersection. From this, we can see that whether your path follows time parsimony or path parsimony in relation to an intersection is ultimately determined by whether that intersection describes the linking parallel structures by negation or affirmation. Since we see also that the transition of a structure from an analog form to a digital one reflects the resumption of time parsimony, we see that the analog structure must flip phase independently of the linked structure to switch from path parsimony to time parsimony. This means that decoupling of parallel structures plays a key role in how you experience an intersection. The structural adjustments described in past episodes thus describe ways by which a previously linked structure is isolated from parallel structures and shifted phase to permit the resumption of time parsimony through affirmational valence. That's the end of the podcast for today.